Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of TBR. I'm George Binns, and the guest this evening is the Assistant Superintendent of School, Dr. Dorothy Flaherty, and the Director of Opportunity, Access, and Equity, Dr. Morgan. Welcome.
Good morning.
Good morning.
And the issue we want to talk about today is something that I picked up from a session they had at the library. The principal of the Hannah School, Gabrielle Montevecchi, was talking about lots of things that are going on, and she kept referring to a particular subject called a curriculum roadmap.
Yes.
And we decided we were going to have a discussion about it. And I think you brought up the idea that we also ought to throw in the issue about the other CRT, the culturally relevant teaching. So start off with, what is a roadmap and how is it different than, say, a lesson plan or syllabus or the usual?
So the roadmap was kind of fortuitous when I came. It was a kind of a phrase that I coined with the principals, and other educational professionals may call it curriculum mapping, and it's done more at the higher level and then the school and then the classroom should build off of that. When I came, my kind of entry discussion with principals and other leaders was to do a kind of my own lesson with them around a journey. So we took a trip and I said to them, here's our endpoint. We all need to get to the Golden Gate Bridge in California, right? And they were given specific things that they needed to do. They needed to stop at least 3 national monuments. They couldn't spend more than one night in any city. So there was criteria that they had to meet in order to get there. And then they went and worked with a group. And other than that, they could get there any way they wanted to. And so then we used that as kind of the vision of a roadmap, saying we need to all start in one place and we need to get to the same place by the end, by a specific point in time. But there are different ways in order to get there. And there are some major criteria that you need to meet along the way. So it was just kind of a symbolism to use with them to explain my thinking. And in working at a district level, we have 5 elementary schools. Yeah. And the elementary schools were all outstanding. And a lot of things they were doing that were similar, but they were also doing some things that were unique to their own schools. And so when I say it was fortuitous, we didn't know COVID was coming. And so we started this in September of 2020. And one of the things that I wanted to do was, especially with our core content areas of English, math, science, and social studies, we wanted to make sure that students were getting the same experience and were hitting the same standards, so that when they came to our middle school, which is our feeder school, they would have the same skill base and still leaving some room for unique things within their own buildings. But there was some key standards and key learning in each of those 4 content areas that we needed to make sure all students were exposed to, and that they all were exposed to the same high expectations. And so that's why we then built on our little introductory lesson to then call them curriculum roadmaps. And what we did was we had grade level teams, and each of the principals from the 5 schools took one grade level. So for an example, Mrs. Montevecchi, who you mentioned, she worked with all the kindergarten teachers across the district. One of the other principals worked with all the first graders, then another one all the third, and then all the fourth. And they looked at the key criteria in each of our 4 content areas that said, these are the experiences that all students need to make sure that they have. When are we going to teach them? How are we going to teach it? And so that they were working on what we called the roadmap. So it's done at the district level. And then from that, the schools and the teachers would look at the roadmap to say, okay, it's, we're moving into the November, December timeframe. Here are the pieces of information I need to make sure that I incorporate in my classroom lessons. And so it just became kind of a term in the district that we use, roadmap, and it basically says it's showing us where we need to go and how we need to get there.
So what determines what these standards are? Are they
Those come from
unique?
the state. No, they're using the state standards from the Department of Education, and we have what we call curriculum frameworks in a lot of different areas. But we were focusing the roadmaps on the 4 content areas: math, English, science, and social studies. And so that's what the state says. Here are the key pieces of learning that all students need to have, and so that's what we use as our roadmaps from the district level. We look at where the state tells us where we need to go, and then we set out our district roadmap on how we're going to get there, and then the schools and the teachers build off of that.
Well, do you have these roadmaps in the middle school and high school too?
They do, but they're done a little bit differently. When we talked about the roadmaps, it was more because we had 5 schools doing different things. At the middle school, we have 3 different teams at each level, and so they're looking at math, science, social studies, and what am I forgetting? English, across the 3 teams, so that we make sure that the students have a similar experience there. And then when we get to the high school, it gets much more complicated because you have your core classes, you have elective classes, and they need to have they use more of a template that they have used all along and are in the process of revising and making more robust. So they're working on it, but it looks a little bit different at the high school level.
So how does this all figure into what you're trying to do for the city in terms of opportunity, access, and equity?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I think I'm going to take the pivot in the conversation and talk about culturally responsive teaching, pedagogy, which is really an approach to learning. And you heard Dr. Flaherty mention a little earlier this idea of a roadmap, if you will, starting at one point and getting to another point during a certain time parameter. And that's really the goal of culturally responsive teaching, if you will, to really help to close academic achievement gaps by having students connect at one level and then all move at the same pace and at the same time to an endpoint. And one of the things that we know with culturally responsive teaching over the years, and it was first introduced in the late 90s by researcher Gloria Ladson-Billings. And while it's widely referenced to African American students, research has shown over the years that culturally responsive teaching has had major impacts on students from all backgrounds and ethnicities. And so it's not just African American students that are benefiting from culturally responsive teaching, but it's Latino students, and it's Asian students, and it's and other students that have some type of difference, including students with disabilities and students who don't speak English as a primary language. And so while it's not a magic bullet or a perfect convention, it is one that helps us to be able to close gaps academically and expose students to the same content and move them down the line, if you will, so that they can become not just knowledgeable and productive citizens, but also change agents in the process.
Well, you're talking about students that come into the system with a different background, and you're trying to get them to a common point, which means some students have to adjust different ways depending on their background. How are they going to? It's like you're talking about a roadmap, and you have guidelines to say, well, you got to visit 3 different national parks. Well, the students that come in with a different background, they're like going to a different national park, but they still got to end up at the Golden Gate Bridge, to your example. So how do you get these students with the different backgrounds to recognize that, yeah, you're going to go a little bit different, on a little different path, but yet it's got to be turned so it all gets to the same place in the end?
So from a tangible example that might make it easier to understand, say I'm a 4th grade teacher and I'm working on a writing assignment. You may have students that are already kind of proficient writers and thinkers, and they can read a prompt and just go to work and do their response. You might have other students that don't have the same knowledge of the academic vocabulary, or they don't have, they're just learning some of the English language, or they haven't been exposed to a lot. Their lower socioeconomic status may not have had some of the same exposures that other students have had, and maybe they've never been on a trip to use, continue. Maybe the prompt is around visiting a national park over summer vacation. So one of the things that we have to do is differentiate within the class, because we want all students to be able to get what they need, right, when we're talking about high expectations for all. So our students that can just go and take off, they can go work independently and do their writing assignment. You might have some students that need to help organize their thinking, right? So we may give them a graphic organizer to use that will help them to kind of write down their thoughts before they go and write. Or they might need to do a pre-write, have somebody look at it, give them some feedback and suggestions, and then let them edit it and go and finish. And then you might have a third group of students that can't start on their own. They don't have the same vocabulary acquisition. And so we might start them with a series of sentence starters. So we would start the sentence for them, and then they would finish it. So it helps them to kind of see the direction that they should be going. So for an example, it might mean, I visited Yellowstone and I saw, and then they would finish what they did.
Yeah.
So the sentence starters. So they're all working on the same assignment. We're expecting high expectations from each of the students, but they each need a little bit something different in order to be able to meet our expectations.
And if I can also compliment
Yeah.
Dr. Flaherty's response, the value of culturally responsive teaching is that the approach focuses on each student's experiences, and that's not always racial. So, if the three of us are sitting in the class, if you will, and the teacher focuses on something that each of us has experienced individually, research shows that when there's an interest point, an entry point, if you will, and there's an interest that's focused on that a student can identify with, that student is more apt to get engaged into the content. And so as we take a look at culturally responsive teaching, and I know that there's a perception that it refers to just talking about race in the classroom. In fact, if we're going to be honest, culturally responsive teaching doesn't even pivot race. It pivots each student's experience. And so if we're talking about addressing the needs of all students, regardless of where they come into the system and their entry points, we're talking about serving each student such that they can get an identifying point and be able to relate the standards and the content that we're sharing into a practical application setting. How do they take what they're learning in a classroom setting and apply it in their individual lives outside of the classroom?
Well, one of the things that comes to mind immediately, you start with this group that they're in tune with the system, and they get it from day one. So you just give them an assignment, and off they go and do their thing. The other students, they take a little longer. What happens to this other group when they finish? I mean, they have time on their hands. What else do they do?
Well, no, we want all students to be challenged, right? So they would have what we call extension assignments. So maybe they're going to do a follow-up or do, further in-depth writing about their experience. Or maybe they finish it and then they work as a group and they peer edit, and then they go back and we expect a higher level of vocabulary for them, so that they go back and they want to go back and use higher level vocabulary, or they may do an extension writing assignment. They may then get to go on and do some more research around whatever the topic is that we're looking at. But it really is making sure that all students get what they need. And so that means from our students that are already at grade level and we want to push them to exceed expectations, down to our students that need scaffolding and extra support in order to meet our expectations.
Well, this gets to the question of, okay, they're exceeding expectations. How do they get challenged to move on? And if they get an extra assignment or they get some additional guidance as to what this report that they're writing or this essay that they're writing is all about, and what more can you say about it so they get ahead. We're ending up with the situation that, definition of equity, that they're getting ahead, so they're in a different group or different level than, say, the average students or the ones that are really challenged.
Well, it goes back to that standard, right? So it's it goes back to meeting the expectations, and then when we have students that are exceeding that, one of the things of being a culturally responsive classroom is student voice and choice. You'll hear that term quite a lot when we're talking, and so it might mean that at that point students get to do a little bit more research into the area that you're looking. It's not going wider; it's going deeper. So they can do some additional research. They can explore an area, of the country or national parks, or we've just been using that as an example. So I'm just keeping that as the example. But they can explore another aspect of national parks that may be of interest to them. Or if they are newer to the country and we've done a unit on national parks, maybe they can then look and try to make connections between what is available in national parks here to something that was in their country that may be a national monument or a national visitation place, and they can look for similarities or differences. So they go deeper into the standard.
So at the high school level, I can understand they would move on to an advanced class and take AP classes instead of the standard class. Well, how do you handle this at the elementary or the middle school level?
As I stated, we would differentiate right within the classroom. So each student is doing what they need and getting what they need in order to achieve the highest level that they can.
Okay, it sounds like a good plan. Where do we go from here? What's the next step in the education system?
So, I'll jump in, with the ability to do deeper dives into content, it certainly has some tangible impacts. And so here's one, for example. Students who take the SAT, the Scholastic Aptitude Test, it's a common assessment. And regardless of the levels that you're in your grade level, you still take that common assessment.
Yeah.
That makes sense, right? And so I remember my own experience taking the SAT, and I was sitting next to this young man who was from another school, and it was actually the school that I would end up having my first teaching experience. And I noticed that throughout each of the 6 sections of the SAT, his head was down. And I just kind of stared, and, at the end of the exam, he looked at me, noticed me staring, and, just kind of retorted out, I didn't know it, all right? And so that kind of rang, is very interesting to me. And I think, as we talk about culturally responsive teaching, what we want to do through our process and the curriculum road mapping and the deeper dives is to prevent that from happening to a student when they get to that point where they have to take a common assessment or where they have to actually apply the content that they're being taught over the span of their years. We want every student to be able to reach their version of the American dream, whatever that is. Mm-hmm. But we know that in order to do that, they need skill sets, and they need to be able to apply those skill sets in a real life and applicable process. And so that's our goal with the deeper dives. That's our goal with meeting students where they are. That's our goal with differentiating instruction, because we understand that if we're really going to help students get to where they need to go, then we've got to do things a little differently. We can't do them in the way that we've done for decades prior. Otherwise, we risk having the same result. Yeah. And the end result has been that there's been a widening gap academically between groups of students. And so how do we close the gap becomes the conversation, and this is one way that we figure that we can do that.
So one of the things that we're trying to get all teachers adept at is using data to inform their planning and their instruction. And so for us, the biggest slice of that is MCAS scores. But we also do common assessments within the district. We do benchmark testing, especially at the elementary schools and the middle school 3 times a year. The high school is doing common assessments, midterms, and finals. And then you can look at that data and say, are we really reaching our goal of high expectations for all students? Are all students achieving at the level that we want them to? And if not, then we need to go back and do a deeper dive into the data to say, why not are students being exposed to honors levels classes as frequently as they should be? do we need to look at our curriculum? We've just purchased a new math curriculum for grades 6 through 12, and this year is a new implementation year of the math curriculum. We are looking at a new ELA curriculum for the elementary schools for next year, and then also currently we'll start right after we get back from break. The middle school and the high school will be examining their ELA curriculum to say, is it culturally responsive? Do we have enough student choice and voice in there? Are we looking at book titles that give us a diverse exposure to literature and to authors from different backgrounds? And so that's one of the things we do. We have a 6-year curriculum review cycle. So each year we're keying in on different aspects of curriculum and making sure that we're changing and addressing to meet both the needs of our students and the needs that they need to be successful moving forward into college, career, or military, whichever option they choose to take.
Well, that's one of the other issues that always concern me about the schools is that the problem right now is there's a lot of kids who can't get into the Essex Tech because it just isn't the space. And this is a different group of students, a different attitude and a different approach to the way things happen. What kind of adjustments are being made in the system to accommodate them, recognizing that they're not going to get to the hands-on kind of experience that Essex Tech provides?
Well, I think that's actually an area we've been doing a lot of work in. And Essex Tech gets over, I think, 800 applications for just over 200 slots.
Yeah.
But they've been a great partner with us, and we're actually one of their biggest contributors to the program that we call the After Dark program, which might be a great topic one day for another conversation. But the After Dark program allows for some of our juniors that may have wanted to go to Essex Tech or after being here for several years realize that a trade is more in the where they want to go. And so they can apply to be part of what we call the After Dark program, which means that they come to Beverly for their first, I think it's their first 2 blocks of the day. And then they actually go, and there's maybe 7 or 8 different trades that have space at the Essex Tech, and they go there for the afternoon and they work on that trade for 2 years. And we're looking to try to expand that program, and they added a few new shops this year that students could choose. And Mrs. Taylor and her leadership team are also working very hard at looking and planning for developing pathways at the high school right here that would also incorporate more trade and more hands-on type learning activities. And so we'll hear more about that coming before the program of studies in March.
Well, I think part of the problem that I recognize, I did a little bit of teaching, and I noticed a significant difference between 3rd graders and 4th graders in that the quality of the questions they would ask. You start with the kids in kindergarten, they just want to talk. They want to be heard. 1st grade's about the same. 3rd grade, they're starting to get a little more into the academic part of the thing. And by the 4th grade, I noticed they're asking extremely good questions, which is my pet peeve about the middle school should have been a 4 through 8 school instead, because I think you need the academic diversity of subject-specific teachers at that level, but that's another lost story. But anyway, but that's where I think the interest starts to show up in hands-on learning or tactile learning. I don't like the emphasis on the trade so much, but it's the different approach to it, and how can we start to address those kids who really need to have the feel of the product to understand what they're doing.
Well, I think you should come on a visit to the elementary schools because you're going to see that happening all the way down in kindergarten. They're doing STEM projects. They're using manipulatives for math. They're using a lot of higher order thinking skills. Our kindergartners can ask you some really good questions.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
And I will share, if you'll allow me to complement the response, is that culturally responsive teaching actually addresses a lot of what you just shared in your question. And that is that culturally responsive teaching really brings out critical thinking skills in students. It brings out the voice and choice, and the more students are able to exhibit and share their voice, the greater their capacity to build their language and their knowledge base collectively. I think the other advantage, I know the other advantage of culturally responsive teaching is that it helps students to identify their passions and their interests, if you will. And so for students who are more interested in a trade career, if you will, and are interested in going on to Essex Tech, what culturally responsive teaching does is it helps to build that skill set that they're going to need in order to get to an Essex Tech. And not even just the admissions process at that point, but even the skill sets that they're going to need even beyond as they go into that particular trade to do well in that trade. And so there's a number of benefits. And again, the idea is that it reaches each student where they are and really brings out the interests of students so that we can continue to build those interests as they go forth in their grade levels and in life collectively.
Could you translate voice and choice for me?
I can. All right. So, one of the things that Student Voice does for me is for students to talk about what it is that they're interested in learning, what they want to touch, what they want to feel, how they want to build it, how they want to shape it. And for instructors to be able to listen to those voices and be able to shape that and make that a part of the curriculum. I think the idea of asking students how they feel about something and talking about it and giving them the space to share and to explore, even when they make mistakes or even when there are some misconceptions, is a real opportunity for learning. And not only is it an opportunity for learning, but it's an opportunity for growth. And that's one engagement tier, if you will, because if students get connected and they feel like their voices are being heard, even if they're being challenged in a classroom setting, students are going to grab one of that information. Students are going to be more interested in doing the research and spending the time and the hours and making sure that they master a particular content, because now you've reached their interest level. And that's what it's all about. How do we reach your interest level so that you can practically apply what you're learning into a real setting and such that it works for you in life?
Just to build on that, we're talking about student choice and voice means that they might be able to demonstrate their learning in a different way. So it doesn't mean all students take that, end of the unit chapter test that we all took when we were in school. Some students are better verbally. So if they can come to you and say, what, can I do this? Or, I want to make a blog, or I want to present this through an artistic outlet. So they might do a drawing and be able to explain the drawing to you. So it's allowing students to have multiple ways to be able to express their learning and not just one size fits all.
Super. Well, we've had a half hour of fun, believe it or not.
Wow, that went fast.
Time flies.
Yeah. And would like to do some more of this because I think there's like this voice and choice. You guys know what it means, but the rest of us don't. I think we need to spend some time on that. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this evening. And like I said, we're going to have more discussion. And you'll notice in the credits that I'm encouraging you to put your voice on the table too and bring your thoughts to the game. Thanks for joining us. Good evening.